Okay, this is Mr. Singleton, and today we're going to be looking at a lesson on using quotations correctly. We're going to talk about how to correctly punctuate quotations, how you should introduce quotations. Then we're also going to get a little bit into something called MLA format and doing internal citation of quotations, which you'll need to do for the AP synthesis essay and for most of the writing you do in college as well. So hopefully this presentation will be helpful to that end. Let's get started. Now, you also may have noticed that there is this small bottle of something called Lucas in the middle of the screen. And if you grew up in San Antonio, like me, then you know exactly what that is. Don't let that distract you, but it does kind of tie in with some of our presentation today. Don't let it throw you off at all. But just know if you happen to want to get your favorite teacher a snack that he happens to love, anything with Chile on it is something that I would gladly accept. I won't change your grade. I won't accept it as a bribe, but it would just make me really happy. So you're welcome to do that. Let's go ahead and get started with the presentation. Now, one of the really important things that I'm going to ask you to do with any quotations you use in your essays for my class is I'm going to ask you to introduce your quotations. This is not the only way you can do quotations, but it's a way that I want you to get really comfortable with before you try to do it other ways. So always introduce your quotes. A quote should never suddenly appear out of nowhere. What do I mean by that? I mean, I should never see a sentence begin with quotation marks in essays that you're doing for me until we've gotten past this first level. The important thing about introducing your quotation is, first of all, it brings out your voice instead of the article or the author that you're quoting, right? Instead of it sounding like one sentence you're writing and then boom, the next sentence somebody totally different has written. If you introduce your quotes with an introductory phrase, it will sound like your voice introducing their voice. It makes it much more smooth. An introduction to a quotation is usually just a part of a sentence. It's a phrase, okay? And in that phrase, you can name the author. You can give the author's credentials. You can name the source that it's coming from. You could even kind of, in a few words, summarize what this quote is presenting. You won't do all of those things each time, but you should at least name the author that you're quoting every time in your introductory phrase. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Let's look at a couple of examples. Both of these quotations are properly introduced. And I want you to take specific note on each of these of how they're punctuated and how they look. You'll notice that the introductory phrase on each one of these quotations, there's an introductory phrase, and there's an introductory phrase. You'll notice that each one would not be a sentence that could stand on its own. If all you read was, but Dr. Brown disagrees with this point saying, well, you'd be leaving someone hanging if that ended in a period, right? So it's a part of a sentence, it's a phrase, and you'll notice it's before the quotation, and we've got the comma, and then the quote. That's an introductory phrase. We have the name of who said the information we're about to read, along with a little bit of information with how this fits in the context of our essay. So, but Dr. Brown disagrees with this point, saying Lucas is bad for people and students shouldn't eat it. All right, that's a properly introduced quote. And there's Dr. Brown from Back to the Future. I'm a big fan. Okay, wait, let's go back a little bit there. Let's look at the second example. In an article in Time, George Lucas writes, once again, comma, quotation mark. Lucas is a delicious treat that tastes great on fruit like oranges, pineapples, and then we have that weird brackets there with that, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. This is not something that you have to know for my class or for the AP test necessarily, but since it's in here, I figured I'd go ahead and tell you about it. We have these three dots. It's called an ellipses, and that ellipses is always supposed to be used when you are leaving some information out from an original quote or something is being taken out. Okay. Now, we have with these brackets around here is if you're ever quoting someone else and you're going to change something that was in that original quote, whether you're going to clarify what an indefinite word is, or you're going to add an ellipses because you didn't want to use part of their quote, you cannot simply put that change in there without letting your audience know that that wasn't the original quote. And the way you let your audience know is you use these sort of square looking parentheses, they're called brackets. You use those to say, hey, this is something I had changed from the original quote. So that's why that's there. But what I want you to really focus on are these introductory phrases. Anytime you quote a source for a synthesis essay in my class, I would like to see you use an introductory phrase like this with some of this introductory information. So you're going to want to memorize that format for using quotations, because that's what I'm going to be looking for. Now, the thing about introductory phrases is they can actually be pretty simple. They could be as simple as saying, Mr. Singleton says, comma, and then quoting what I said. But that's pretty boring. What we want you to think about is I want you to pick the quotation verb which seems in each case to fit your purpose most exactly. So don't necessarily stick with the word says. That's a pretty elementary word. We want you to try to play around with that a little bit. So if you notice, the verb you choose helps lead your reader toward your opinion of the statement. So it's not just about having a fancy word in there, a fancy verb for says, but it's about also kind of letting the audience know what you want them to think about the quote that's coming after, right? So a word like says is pretty neutral, right? Also words like writes are pretty neutral, okay? I'd always rather use writes than says if it's something written down, right? But you can notice that not all of these verbs are neutral, right? Look at this one. Mr. Lucas informs us. If Mr. Lucas is informing us, it functions the same way as says here, but it's much more positive because what we're telling the audience is that what's about to come up is not Mr. Lucas's opinion, but it's information that Mr. Lucas is giving us. It makes us think more positively about what's following, right? You could do something like this too, though. Mr. Lucas alleges. Once again, the word alleges is functioning the same as says there, but alleges has a more negative connotation, a more negative feeling to it. When we think of something being alleged, that means it's not proven. So whatever quote follows after that, we should know is something that we're supposed to have a shred of doubt towards, okay? So there are lots of different verbs to choose from. Here are some examples. What I'd like you to do is go ahead and pause this podcast, read through some of these words that you can use instead of says, and maybe write down some of the ones that you really like or some that you think you would use to enhance your writing and to enhance your introductory phrases, and actually use those when we do our synthesis timed writings and any other writing that you do. Go ahead and pause for a second and look at those words. Okay, let's move on. One thing you should also do, and this kind of connects back to the lesson we did on argument and evidence. We talked about with that anytime you use evidence, which is often in something like a synthesis essay, a quotation from somewhere else, whenever you use evidence, you should explain that evidence. I think the same is true of using any quotations. Always discuss your quotations after you give it. So you have the introductory phrase, you have the quote, and then at the end of that quotation, the next sentence or several sentences should explain. Do not quote someone and then leave the words hanging and as if they were self-explanatory. Once again, that's assuming, and we remember that nothing good happens when you assume, right? You can answer questions like, what does the quotation mean? How does it help establish the point you're making? What's your interpretation or opinion of the quotation? What part of the quotation do you want your audience to focus on? Those are all different things you can use in your discussion of the quotation after you give it. So every source that you quote, every quote you use in your writing, you should have an introductory phrase, a comma, give the quote, and then the next few sentences you should spend some time doing this, discussing your quotations. Now, a lot of students actually have trouble doing this. They actually have trouble transitioning, like I had trouble transitioning between those two slides there, they have trouble transitioning from the quote to this discussion part, to this part where they're explaining the quote. So what I've done here is I've given you a list of some phrasing you can use after a quote to maybe help get you started in that discussion part. So let's say the quotation has ended and then you want to get into explaining your quote. These are some phrases that you can use. Here we see that, right? And then you can tell me what it is you want me to see. This statement shows. Well, you can tell me exactly what you wanted me to get from that statement. Clearly, then, that phrase kind of makes me feel like, hey, if I didn't get this, I'm missing something big, right? We can conclude from this that. This tells us that. From this, we can understand that. All of these phrases might be useful to you, so you might want to pause and write down some of these phrases. Go ahead and do that. All right, I want to show you one more thing on here before we go to the next slide. If you notice, many of these phrases, and I'm jumping around like crazy here, but that's all right. Many of these phrases use this word we. We, we, we. Okay, that is actually a great strategy that writers use, and you should start to notice it when you read and also try to use it in your own writing. It's something that I like to call forced teaming. And what I mean by that is when you use the word we in your writing, when an author uses the word we in their writing, it subconsciously makes the reader think that they're on your team, even if they don't agree with you. If you're saying, here we see that, you've already put them on your team. And it makes them a little more willing to accept whatever you're going to say after that. We can conclude. It sounds much better than saying you can conclude or I can conclude, because it puts you and your audience on the same team. It's a very effective strategy. You should always look to see where authors use that strategy. Okay, moving on, I did want to give you a little bit of information about ways that you can use sources other than just a direct quote. So, for instance, on the synthesis essay, you'll be given these 6 different sources, right? And 6 or 7 different sources. And these sources will have all kinds of different information, and you'll have to read through those and pick out certain parts of some of those sources that back up the argument you're making. You're going to want to use those in your essay. So there's a number of ways to do that. You can directly quote it. That's like what we've been talking about the last few minutes here. An example of a direct quote, in the words of Lil Wayne, I mean every letter in the words and the sentences of my quotes. Now you'll notice something about this direct quote that I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a second, but they have what's called internal citation, and that's in MLA format. And you'll notice usually if this source D in parentheses wasn't there, the period should go right after quotes and before the quotation mark. But that period's been moved outside of that, and this has been added in parentheses source D. That's telling us which source it came from. On the synthesis essay, on any papers that you write in MLA format, which is a lot of what you'll do in college, you will be required to do this internal citation. And it's really important to know how to do that. But you may not always use a direct quote. You may read something in a source and you maybe don't want to quote it word for word, but you want to get the same idea across in your own words. Well, that's something you got to be very careful with. If you don't give credit to that information, even if you don't use it word for word, you're plagiarizing. What you're trying to do is paraphrase information, and it's perfectly fine to paraphrase information as long as you give credit to the source it came from. A paraphrase will not use the exact words in the original quote. So if Lil Wayne's original quote was, I mean every letter in the words and the sentences of my quotes, a paraphrase of that might look like this. According to Lil Wayne, he is sincere about everything he says in his songs. Now you'll notice there's no quotation marks on there because we're not quoting him word for word, but we still have this internal MLA citation. We're going to talk more about MLA citation a little bit later on in the year and get into the real rules of all of MLA and things like that, but you need to know how to do this at the very least. There are other ways of using direct quotes and quotations, and there's a lot of different ways to work with quotes other than just the introductory phrase. And as you get better and better at using quotations, you'll get better and better at trying some of these things. Just to give you an idea about that, sometimes you might want to begin your quotation in the middle of your own sentence, right? And just use a part of the quote. So, for example, let's imagine you read a source that the author, Mr. Lucas, had written this sentence in. I make Lucas because I believe that all children need salt and chile. And you wanted to use that sentence in your writing, but you didn't want to directly quote the whole thing, and you didn't want to just paraphrase the whole thing. You kind of wanted to do a combination of both. Well, you can do that. It might look something like this. Mr. Lucas believes that all children need. Now, the reason that's in quotation marks is because we're using the exact phrasing from up here, right? All children need. So we want to say that came word for word from somewhere. The ingredients of Lucas. Now that's a paraphrase, right? We're paraphrasing. What are salt and chile? The ingredients of Lucas. And we still attribute the source, right? We still say that came from source B. But that's how you would do that. So let me give you a little bit more information about this standard MLA citation style, because from now on, anytime you write a synthesis essay or a research paper in my class, anytime you quote from something in my class, I would like you to use this style. So let me show you how simple it is. All an in-text citation needs to be, according to the MLA style book, is to have the last name of the author you're quoting followed by a page number. Now, there are some complications to that sometimes. Sometimes you're not giving the name of an author, and there's other problems that you encounter, and there's rules for all of that that we'll get into later on in the year. But for most of what we're going to do, this formula should work. If you notice, let's say that this quote, Lucas does not rot children's teeth, came from an article written by Jenkins, and it came from page 242. Okay, so that's simply how you would do it. You would move the period from after teeth and before the quotation mark. You would move it to the end of this citation, and in parentheses you would write the author's last name and the page number. What you're doing there is actually giving your readers a reference for the end of your piece of writing. You won't have this on AP timed writing or on the AP test, but they're trying to get you to practice doing it. But there is a thing called a works cited page. You won't have that works cited page on an AP writing or an AP test. You will have internal citation, you won't have the works cited page. A works cited page is something at the end of a piece of academic writing that lists all the sources you used or that contributed to the paper that you wrote, right? And that list is organized by author's last name, and it gives you more information about the source that you got it come from. Kind of like a bibliography that you might be more used to. But this information is supposed to tell them where to look in your works cited. So AP, the College Board, wants you to get used to doing that. Now what's cool is they've made that even easier for you guys. And I'm really, by the way, sorry about how disturbing this picture is. I hope that didn't gross anybody out too bad. It kind of grosses me out. Don't eat Lucas too much, okay? But they've made it really easy for you to do this internal citation because they said, you know what, you don't even have to use the last name of the author and the page number for the sources we give you on the synthesis essay. Each one of those sources for the synthesis essay will give you the name of the author and all that information, but they'll also have a much simpler title at the top, and it'll say source A or source B, like that. And they've said on the AP test, you can simply use that to give you more time. So it would look like Mr. Lucas stands by his claim that Lucas does not rot children's teeth, source E in parentheses. So that's a much easier way of going about it. Well, I hope this presentation was helpful for you. I hope you have a better idea of what I'm looking for when you're using quotes in my class, what the College Board's looking for on the AP test, and what you're going to have to do in your college style writing. If you have any questions or you don't quite understand it still, please write those questions down. Email those questions to me. Come by and talk to me. I want to make sure you understand this. Feel free to go back over this lesson and look at it as a review before we do any timed writings, or just if you're not sure. It's a great way to go over that information. All right, until next time.